Welcome to our weekly wrap-up of Eurotech for the week of November 30th to December 5th. We've picked 5 key stories that tech enthusiasts and investors in Europe should know about. I'm your co-host, Mark Candlish.
I'm Brian Welshly.
And I am Lily Larini.
Let's dive in. Italian tech company Bending Spoons is making waves by acquiring Eventbrite, the popular US-based event platform, in an all-cash deal worth about 430 million euros. Eventbrite will become a private company once the deal closes next year. This is a big move. Bending Spoons has quietly built a portfolio of well-known digital products, including Evernote, WeTransfer, Vimeo, Komoot, and Meetup. Now they're adding Eventbrite to that list. It's not often we see a European company buying a high-profile American tech firm, so this stands out.
As reported and discussed in one of our deep dives some weeks ago, Bending Spoons has been pursuing a strategy of acquiring established platforms and investing in them for the long term. Earlier this year, they even raised over 500 million euros in financing to fuel such acquisitions, and they bought Vimeo for around 1.1 billion euros. These moves have turned Bending Spoons into one of Europe's tech giants, reportedly valued at over $10 billion, a rare decacorn in the European scene. For Eventbrite, joining Bending Spoons means access to more resources and innovation to help people find and host events.
This acquisition signals a shift in tech power dynamics. A European company expanding its empire by purchasing a major U.S. tech platform is a bold statement. It shows that Europe's tech players are growing strong enough to compete globally and even absorb Silicon Valley names. For investors, it's a sign that European tech firms can scale up and pursue aggressive growth strategies, potentially delivering significant returns and fostering a more globally competitive European tech ecosystem.
In regulatory news, the European Union is cracking down on Meta, the owner of WhatsApp, over a recent policy change. Meta decided that starting in January, WhatsApp will ban third-party AI chatbots, basically stopping outside AI services like OpenAI's ChatGPT or others from working on WhatsApp. The EU's competition watchdogs announced an antitrust investigation into this move, concerned that Meta might be unfairly squeezing out potential competitors.
Here's the background. WhatsApp's new policy says its business API, the interface companies use on WhatsApp, isn't meant for general chatbots, only for things like customer service bots. Meta wants WhatsApp users to only have Meta's own AI assistant called Meta AI. The European Commission is worried this could harm innovation and limit choices for users in Europe. They pointed out that Meta's dominant position could let it block rivals' AI services, which might violate EU competition rules. If Meta is found to have broken the rules, they could face a hefty fine, up to 10% of their global annual revenue, and be forced to change their practices quickly.
Europe is sending a clear message that big tech companies can't just shut out competitors, especially in emerging areas like AI. This investigation is important for maintaining an open AI ecosystem, ensuring startups and alternative AI providers have a fair shot to reach users. For tech enthusiasts, it highlights how Europe often takes the lead in tech regulation to protect consumers and smaller innovators. And for investors, it shows that regulatory actions can impact how big platforms operate in Europe, which could shape the market for AI tools and chatbots in the region.
Germany just produced another tech unicorn. Black Forest Labs, a German AI startup known for its image-generating technology, has raised a whopping $300 million in fresh funding. This new round values the young company at about $3.25 billion. It's one of the largest investments in a European AI startup this year, signaling serious confidence from investors.
What does Black Forest Labs do? Founded only in 2024, they develop AI models that can create and even help edit images. Their Flux image generation models are open source and apparently quite popular, used on platforms like Hugging Face, and adopted by big names such as Adobe, Canva, Meta, and Microsoft for various projects. The funding round attracted major global investors like Salesforce Ventures, Andreessen Horowitz, NVIDIA, and others. It's not just a big deal for the company, but also a reflection of Europe's AI sector gaining momentum. In fact, investment in European AI startups has been rising. For example, in the third quarter of this year, around $5.2 billion was invested in AI ventures across Europe, a big jump from the same time last year, though still much less than what we see in the US or Asia.
Black Forest Labs' success coming on the heels of other big European AI raises, like France's Mistral AI earlier this year, suggests a growing ecosystem where local founders can secure mega rounds and potentially keep homegrown innovation in Europe. Investors will note that global players are betting on European tech talent, which could mean more funding flowing into the region's startups and possibly more breakthroughs coming from Europe.
In another notable development, US-based AI giant OpenAI, the company behind ChatGPT, is acquiring a European startup, specifically Poland's Neptune. Neptune is a startup from Warsaw that builds tools to help track and manage AI model training. Think of it as software to monitor how large AI models learn and improve. OpenAI was actually a customer of Neptune's platform, using it to keep an eye on the training of its own AI models. Now OpenAI decided to buy the company outright.
The financial details haven't been officially disclosed, but reports suggest OpenAI is paying under $400 million for Neptune, mostly in stock. For Neptune's team and investors, that's a significant exit, especially since the startup had raised far less than that, around $18 million, before the acquisition. This is a big deal because it's one of OpenAI's first known acquisitions, and it happens to be a European company. OpenAI itself has grown tremendously. It was valued around $500 billion in a recent private share sale, and there's talk it could even aim for a $1 trillion valuation if it goes public in the future. Questions are recently being asked about the edge that OpenAI lost to Google's Gemini, but OpenAI is still undoubtedly a leader in the area. By scooping up Neptune, OpenAI is strengthening its own AI development process. The deal also shows that valuable AI innovation is happening in Europe, to the point that a global leader like OpenAI finds it worthwhile to acquire European tech expertise. Rounding out our week, we have a success story from Spain in the smart TV space. Titan OS, a Barcelona-based startup, secured 50 million euros, about $58 million, in Series A funding led by Highland Europe. Titan OS isn't about phones or computers. It's an operating system for smart TVs. The idea is to help TV manufacturers get more value from their customers, even after selling the television sets.
How does that work? In today's market, TV hardware is often sold at thin profit margins due to heavy competition. Titan OS provides TV makers with a software platform that can generate ongoing revenue through partnerships. For example, Titan OS integrates streaming apps, live broadcast channels, and free ad-supported channels all in one place for the viewer. In return, TV makers can earn money from advertising and service partnerships shown on the TV interface. Titan OS already has deals with major brands like Philips and JVC, and it reaches about 18 million users across Europe and Latin America. The company's founders have experience. One founder previously built a streaming service and sold it to Rakuten. And now they're applying that know-how to help TV brands monetize beyond the initial sale.
This story shows the diversity and innovation in European tech. It's not just fintech apps or AI labs. Here we have a startup reinventing how an entire industry like television manufacturing makes money. For tech enthusiasts, Titan OS is a reminder that Europe can produce competitive tech solutions, even in areas dominated by giant players. Think of smart TV platforms usually coming from the likes of Google or Roku. For investors, the €50 million investment indicates confidence in Titan OS's business model. It highlights that European startups are addressing global market needs and can attract significant funding to scale up, potentially carving out a strong position in the smart home and entertainment tech market.
In this week's deep dive, we're talking about something at the core of Europe's future: disruptive energy technologies and how they can transform both our energy system and our industrial competitiveness. We'll connect three big themes: why Europe needs secure and affordable energy, the technologies that can deliver it, from renewables and smart grids to nuclear, fusion, hydrogen, and even solar power from space, and how all of this affects the industrial heart of Europe: cars, steel, chemicals, cement, manufacturing, and digital infrastructure. So let's dive in. Over the past few years, Europe has had a brutal lesson in how important energy really is. For a long time, Europe relied heavily on imported fossil fuels, especially natural gas from Russia. When Russia invaded Ukraine, that dependence suddenly became a huge geopolitical risk. Prices soared, supplies were uncertain, and industries felt real pain. The European Union decided this cannot continue. The EU set a clear goal: to phase out Russian gas by 2027 and reduce dependence on any single external supplier. But this was not just about politics, it was also about money. European industries have been paying much more for electricity than their competitors in the US and China. In recent years, European factories often paid around 2.5 times more for power than many American or Chinese plants. For energy-intensive sectors, steel, chemicals, cement, glass, fertilizers, this is not a small detail. It is the difference between opening a new plant or closing an old one. So Europe faces a double challenge. 1. Security, less dependence on imported fossil fuels. 2. Competitiveness, lower, more stable energy costs.
To respond, Europe is pushing hard on homegrown, clean energy. Policies like the European Green Deal and the Fit for 55 package were already in place to cut emissions. Now they also serve another goal: economic survival in a volatile world. The new playbook is simple in words, hard in practice. Build as much renewable energy as possible at home. Upgrade the grid so it can handle all that new power. Add new nuclear in a smarter, smaller format. And bet early on future breakthroughs, like fusion, hydrogen, and even solar power collected in space.
I think the key idea is clear. Energy policy is now industrial policy. If Europe can get cheap, clean, reliable energy, then its factories, data centers, and startups can compete or even lead against the US and China. If energy stays expensive and unreliable, many of those assets will slowly move away. So when we talk about wind, hydrogen, or fusion, we are not just talking about climate. We are talking about jobs, exports, and long-term power in the global economy. With that in mind, let's look at what is changing right now.
If you fly over Europe today, the energy transition is clearly visible. In the North Sea and Baltic Sea, huge offshore wind farms stretch to the horizon. These projects now generate gigawatts of power and keep growing every year. Across Spain, Portugal, Italy, and even further north in Germany and Poland, solar panels cover rooftops, warehouses, and fields. In 2024 alone, Europe added tens of gigawatts of new renewable capacity, like building several large power plants every month, but powered by the sun and wind instead of coal and gas. This is great news, but it created a problem. The electricity grid, the wires that move power across Europe, was not designed for this new world. It was built for a small number of big power plants, not for thousands of wind and solar farms. Sometimes wind and solar generate more electricity than the grid can handle. In those moments, operators are forced to curtail production. They tell wind or solar farms to shut down, even if the sun is shining or the wind is blowing. That means wasting clean energy.
Building new traditional power lines is slow. It can take 10 years or more to plan, approve, and build a big transmission line. Local opposition and complex permitting often delay projects. So Europe is asking, how can we squeeze more capacity out of the grid we already have? The answer is smart grid technology. Grid operators are now installing digital control systems that reroute power in real time, advanced power flow controllers that push more electricity through existing lines, new, higher capacity conductors that carry more current without changing the pylons. These technologies can boost grid capacity by 20 to 40% by 2040. In some specific lines, throughput can increase by several times. It's like turning a 2-lane road into a 4- or 6-lane highway without rebuilding the entire road.
Because every extra bit of grid capacity means less wasted wind and solar, more hours where clean power sets the market price, lower average electricity costs for industry and households. Think of it this way. Renewables are the new fuel, and the grid is the new logistics system. Optimizing the grid is one of the cheapest and fastest ways to cut energy prices and emissions at the same time. It is not glamorous, but it is absolutely essential. And of course, batteries and other storage solutions are starting to help too, taking excess solar at midday and feeding it back into the system in the evening. Now, renewables will do a lot, but they are variable. Europe still wants some firm, always-on power to support them. That is where a new wave of nuclear comes in.
When many people think of nuclear power, they imagine massive plants built in the 1970s. Big, slow, expensive. But a new generation of small modular reactors, or SMR, is trying to change that image. SMRs are much smaller than traditional reactors, modular, so many parts are built in factories, designed to be faster to construct and easier to finance. One of the most visible projects in Europe is Rolls-Royce SMR in the UK. The UK government has chosen the Wilfa site on the island of Anglesey in Wales for its first 3 SMR units. Each unit aims to generate about 470 megawatts of electricity, enough to power a city, and to operate for at least 60 years. The important point, Rolls-Royce plans to build about 90% of each reactor in factory conditions, then ship the modules to the site for assembly. This is more like building an airplane or a car than a unique mega project.
Across Europe, interest is growing. Countries like Sweden, Finland, Poland, and Estonia are all exploring SMR options. And Europe has its own nuclear startups too. One example is Nucleo, originally based in Italy and now in France. Nucleo is working on a lead-cooled fast reactor design, a small reactor that can potentially use existing nuclear waste as fuel. However, Nucleo has also sent a warning. In 2025, it started looking at building a fleet of reactors in the US because licensing there looked faster and more predictable. This highlights a major lesson. Even the best technology can move elsewhere if regulation is too slow.
So why are SMRs strategically important? They provide 24/7 low-carbon power to back up renewables. Their smaller size makes them easier to site on old coal plant locations or next to heavy industry. If Europe gets good at designing and building them, SMRs can become a new export product, just like Airbus did in aviation. But there is a condition. Europe must speed up and simplify its approval processes. If not, its best nuclear innovators may simply build their projects in countries that move faster. If Europe does get this right, the power mix in the early 2030s could be lots of wind and solar, a smarter, stronger grid, and a first wave of SMRs providing reliable baseload power. And that is the bridge to the more radical technologies we will talk about next.
Fusion is often called the holy grail of energy. Instead of splitting atoms, fission, like current nuclear plants, fusion combines light atoms, like hydrogen, into heavier ones, releasing a huge amount of energy, just like the sun does. The promises of fusion are extremely attractive. No long-lived, high-level radioactive waste, no meltdown risk in the same way as fission, fuel that can be derived from water and other abundant sources. For decades, fusion was always 20 years away. But something has changed. Public projects and private startups are now moving faster, and some timelines are starting to overlap. In Europe, the most famous project is ITER in France, a giant experimental machine built by a global partnership. ITER's goal is to show that we can produce more energy from fusion than we put in, at large scale. Alongside ITER, a new ecosystem of private fusion companies has appeared, especially in the UK. Firms like Tokamak Energy and First Light Fusion are testing compact designs and new approaches. In 2025, a strong link formed between the UK and the US. TAE Technologies, a California-based fusion company backed by Google, set up a joint venture with the UK Atomic Energy Authority. Their focus is on neutral beam systems, basically high-energy particle beams used to heat and control fusion plasmas.
Some private companies now talk about building pilot fusion plants in the 2030s, while the UK's own STEP program targets a demonstration plant around 2040. The EU is planning its own long-term DEMO reactor for later. These dates may shift. Fusion is still high risk, but for the first time, serious governments and serious investors are acting as if commercial fusion in our lifetime is realistic, not science fiction.
Brian, why should European businesses care now if fusion is still decades away?
Because if Europe succeeds in fusion, it gets something close to unlimited, clean, domestic energy. Imagine a world where the marginal cost of electricity is very low, and Europe never worries about fuel imports again. Fusion will not solve Europe's 2030 climate targets, but it could transform Europe's 2040 to 2100 landscape. The countries that build fusion first will not only have cheap power, they will also own the technologies, supply chains, and engineering know-how that everybody else needs. So fusion is a strategic bet, high risk, but possibly the highest reward of any energy technology.
While fusion is long-term, hydrogen is much closer to market. Hydrogen is already used today in refineries and fertilizer plants. The big change now is how it is made and what it is used for. Until recently, most hydrogen was gray hydrogen made from natural gas, with large CO2 emissions. Now Europe wants green hydrogen, produced by splitting water with renewable electricity in a process called electrolysis. The EU's goal is to produce around 10 million tons of renewable hydrogen per year by 2030 and import another 10 million tons. That is a huge scale-up. Why so ambitious? Because hydrogen can replace coal in steel production, replace gas as a feedstock in fertilizers and chemicals, act as a fuel for heavy transport, trucks, shipping, maybe aviation, store energy from summer to winter in large quantities.
Let's look at two concrete examples. First, Hybrid in Sweden. Hybrid uses hydrogen instead of coal to turn iron ore into sponge iron, which is then melted in an electric furnace. The result? Steel with almost no CO2 emissions. Hybrid has already delivered fossil-free steel for test vehicles and aims for full commercial production in the next few years. Another company, H2 Green Steel, is building a large hydrogen-based steel plant, also in Sweden. Why Sweden? Because it has abundant hydro and wind power at competitive prices. The cheap, clean electricity is what makes green hydrogen, and therefore green steel, possible. Second, Yara in Norway, one of the world's biggest fertilizer producers. Yara has opened a large green hydrogen and ammonia plant. The project uses renewable electricity to produce hydrogen, then turns it into ammonia for fertilizer. This cuts tens of thousands of tons of CO2 emissions per year and helps create low-carbon fertilizer for European farmers. Ammonia from green hydrogen can also be used as a future shipping fuel.
Hydrogen is not perfect. Today, green hydrogen is still expensive. It can cost 2 to 3 times more than hydrogen made from gas, and it takes a lot of electricity, roughly 50 to 60 megawatt hours to make 1 ton of hydrogen. But this is exactly why Europe's push for cheap renewable power is so important. The cheaper and cleaner electricity becomes, the more competitive green hydrogen becomes. If Europe can scale hydrogen and bring down its cost, it can decarbonize heavy industry, create a new hydrogen equipment industry, electrolyzers, storage tanks, pipelines, and reduce dependence on imported fossil gas. This is not just an energy story, it is a strategic industrial story.
The last technology in this future section sounds the most like science fiction: space-based solar power. Here's the idea. Put very large solar panels in orbit where the sun shines all the time. Convert the energy into microwaves or laser beams. Send that energy down to special receiving stations on Earth. Feed it into the grid as clean, 24/7 power. In space, there is no night, no clouds, and sunlight is stronger. A single large space solar satellite could, in theory, deliver gigawatts of constant power. Europe is not ignoring this. The European Space Agency launched the Solaris initiative to study how realistic this is and whether Europe should invest. Research from European universities suggests that by mid-century, if the technology becomes practical, space solar could supply a large share of Europe's energy and reduce the need for storage, because it is always available.
Of course, there are big challenges: launch costs and the need for reusable rockets. building and maintaining huge structures in space, ensuring that wireless power beams are safe and well controlled. This is not a 2030 technology. It is more like a post-2040 or 2050 option, but ESA and some governments are interested because space solar could be a kind of ultimate renewable, always on, controllable, and not dependent on weather.
The important point is strategic and long-term, not immediate. By exploring space solar now, Europe keeps open the option of a very high-potential technology that others, like China, the US, or Japan, are also exploring. Think of space-based solar as a potential Apollo project for energy. If it works, whoever masters it first gains a huge advantage in both energy security and high-tech industry, from advanced satellites to robotics. So we have near-term tools, renewables, smart grids, SMRS, mid-term tools, hydrogen, advanced nuclear, large-scale storage, long-term bets, fusion, and space solar. Now let's connect all of this to the sectors that actually pay the energy bill. Europe's industries.
Europe's economy still rests heavily on its industrial base. Cars and trucks, steel and metals, chemicals and fertilizers, cement and construction materials, machinery, manufacturing, and more. These sectors are energy hungry. They also face strong global competition and increasing pressure to cut emissions. If energy is expensive and dirty, Europe loses twice: higher costs and higher carbon penalties. If energy becomes cheap and clean, Europe gets a double win: lower operating costs and a stronger story for customers and regulators. Let's look at how disruptive energy technologies play out in some key sectors.
Europe's automotive industry is going through the biggest shift in its history: the move from combustion engines to electric vehicles. EVs change the game in two ways. 1. Cars no longer burn petrol or diesel. They consume electricity. 2. The most valuable component, the battery, is very energy-intensive to produce. This is where energy becomes central. Enter Northvolt, a Swedish battery company that wants to build the world's greenest batteries in Europe. Northvolt decided to build its main gigafactory, Northvolt Ep10, in northern Sweden for one key reason: very cheap, very clean electricity from hydro and wind. The plant runs on 100% renewable power. That gives Northvolt two big advantages. 1. The CO2 footprint of its batteries is much lower than batteries made in coal-powered regions. 2. The electricity price is relatively competitive and stable, which is vital when your factory consumes huge amounts of power. Northvolt has already signed major supply contracts with European car makers like Volkswagen and BMW.
This is not just a green story. It's a strategic supply chain story. By producing batteries in Europe with low-carbon energy, European car makers reduce their dependence on imported batteries. They meet increasingly strict EU rules on carbon footprints and local content. They protect themselves from geopolitical shocks.
Where you place energy-intensive factories will increasingly follow where cheap, clean power is available, not just cheap labor. If Europe can keep electricity prices low through renewables, SMRS, and good grids, it can keep battery plants and car plants close to home. If it fails, those factories may drift to places that offer cheaper power or bigger subsidies. For example, under the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act. So for cars and batteries, the energy transition is not a side issue. It is a core competitiveness factor.
Steel is vital for cars, buildings, machinery, wind turbines, almost everything. Traditional steelmaking uses coke from coal in huge blast furnaces. This releases enormous amounts of CO2. Steel alone accounts for roughly 7 to 8% of global emissions. In Europe, this is made even harder by carbon pricing. Steelmakers must pay for their emissions under the EU emissions trading system. This raises costs compared to producers in countries with weaker climate policies. Projects like Hybrid in Sweden offer a different path. Hybrid uses green hydrogen instead of coal to remove oxygen from iron ore. The output is sponge iron and water vapor, not CO2. This sponge iron is then turned into steel in an electric furnace using renewable electricity. Hybrid has already produced the world's first fossil-free steel for trial use. The goal is large-scale commercial production that replaces old coal-based routes. Alongside Hybrid, H2 Green Steel is building another large hydrogen-based plant in Sweden, also targeting low-carbon steel for sectors like automotive.
Other European players are moving too. Big steel companies in Germany and France are testing hydrogen injection into blast furnaces and planning new direct reduction plants based on hydrogen. Again, these projects all need cheap renewable power, because producing hydrogen through electrolysis is electricity intensive.
If European steelmakers can get enough cheap, clean electricity and hydrogen, they can avoid large carbon costs, sell green steel at a premium to customers who value low-carbon supply chains, keep high-quality jobs and capabilities in Europe. If they cannot, there is a risk that more steel production will shift to regions with cheaper energy and looser rules, and Europe will import more steel instead. So steel is a test case for Europe. Can it turn a high-emission, high-cost industry into a high-tech, low-carbon export story? The answer depends heavily on the cost and reliability of clean energy.
We should briefly place this in a global context. The United States is using large subsidies and tax credits to attract clean energy and manufacturing through laws like the Inflation Reduction Act. China has invested heavily in solar panels, batteries, and electric vehicles, and still provides relatively cheap power to its industries, often from coal. Europe, by choice, has higher environmental standards and a strong carbon policy. It cannot win a race to the bottom on cheap coal power or low wages.
This means Europe's winning strategy has to be innovation, better technologies, not cheaper fuel, efficiency, using grids, storage, and digital tools to get more out of each asset, speed and scale, moving from pilot projects to commercial rollout quickly. If Europe gets this right, disrupting its own energy system is not a cost. It becomes a competitive advantage.
Let's finish with a thought experiment. Imagine Europe in the year 2045 or 2050. Huge offshore wind farms in the North Sea and Atlantic. A dense web of smart, high-capacity grids across the continent. A backbone of SMRs and maybe some first fusion plants providing reliable baseload power. A mature hydrogen network linking ports, industrial clusters, and pipelines. Perhaps even a few space-based solar power systems feeding constant energy into the grid. Electricity is clean, with very low emissions, stable and reliable, and much cheaper on average than in the early 2020s. Energy is no longer a central worry, it is more like a background utility. What changes?
First, innovation speeds up. If electricity is cheap and low carbon, it becomes easier to train giant AI models without worrying about huge energy bills or emissions. Run supercomputers and complex simulations for science and industry. Power millions of sensors and devices in smart cities, smart factories, and smart farms. We might see more robotic automation in warehouses, factories, and agriculture, more vertical farms and controlled environment food production, more edge computing, small local data centers everywhere. Second, industry reshoring becomes realistic. Energy-intensive industries that once left Europe might come back or expand if Europe can offer secure, cheap, clean power, skilled labor, and access to rich markets. Third, we can go beyond net zero and move towards climate repair.
With very cheap clean energy, we could run large-scale direct air capture plants to take CO2 out of the atmosphere, produce synthetic fuels from captured CO2, and green hydrogen for aviation and shipping. Support more ambitious climate adaptation and geoengineering projects if the world chooses to use them carefully. Households would spend less of their income on heating, cooling, and transport. Energy poverty would shrink. Cities could be cleaner and quieter with electric mobility and better air quality. In this world, the main constraint on progress would be imagination and governance, not energy. That is what some people mean when they talk about free energy. Not literally zero price, but energy so abundant and cheap that it no longer limits what we can do.
We started this episode with a crisis: war, supply shocks, and painful energy prices. But we have seen how that crisis has pushed Europe to rethink its entire energy system and to invest in bold technologies. Near-term, renewables, smarter grids, storage, and small modular reactors. Mid-term, hydrogen and deep decarbonization of heavy industry. Long-term, fusion, and maybe even solar power from space. We also saw how all of this connects directly to industries that matter: cars, steel, chemicals, cement, aluminium, data centers, and more.
The energy transition is not just a climate story. It is one of the biggest industrial shifts of our lifetime. Entire value chains will be rebuilt, from energy production to materials, logistics, and digital infrastructure. In every part of this story, there is space for new companies, new business models, and new leadership.
Europe cannot compete on cheap fossil fuel, but it can compete on technology, system design, and long-term vision. If Europe builds out affordable, clean energy at scale, removes unnecessary barriers for new projects, and supports the link between energy innovation and industrial strategy, then the continent can turn a position of vulnerability into a strategic advantage. Instead of talking about de-industrialization, we could be talking about a green industrial renaissance.
So, as you follow the news in the coming years, SMR decisions, hydrogen projects, fusion milestones, new battery plants, green steel announcements, remember the bigger picture. These are not isolated headlines. They are pieces of a new energy and industrial system that Europe is trying to build. If Europe succeeds, energy may one day become almost an afterthought, and creativity will be the real limit.
Thank you for joining us on this journey through disruptive energy technologies and Europe's future.
This podcast was produced by Asif Rajani and brought to you by Eurotech.vc, empowering Europe to lead the global tech race.